let me know. Good evening. So tonight I'm introducing you to Prof. Diane Ceo-DiFrancesco, that serves as a faculty director of the Eigel Center for Community Engaged Learning, and she's a professor in Spanish and teaches at the Xavier University. She has served Xavier University as the interim associate provost, a faculty director of the Center of Teaching Excellence, and she teaches courses in Spanish language, linguistics, culture, and word language pedagogy, and has integrated community engagement learning, virtual exchange, and collaborative online international learning into courses that she teaches. And we discussed it because I think with the next session, she will share with us what is collaborative online international learning and what is the pedagogy behind this. She has published in a number of journals, and we are very happy to have you here tonight. So we're looking forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martina. I'm really happy to be here today. For me, it's today. It's the beginning of our afternoon, and for you, it's the evening. So, so that's interesting, and it's very interesting how much our world has been changing, right? I think it's more and more of a reason to think about utilizing Photovoice as participatory research methodology. So during this session, I have several objectives. I'd like to share with you briefly the theoretical underpinnings of Photovoice research, why it came about, and then we'll examine the research design for Photovoice projects. And we'll do a little bit of comparison, and I'll probably ask you also to compare, those of you that have done qualitative research or mixed methods, you know, what are some of the distinctions between Photovoice and then traditional research projects that you may have done. And I'm going to share with you two, one that we've completed and one that we're in the process. It's ongoing. So I'm really excited to share those projects with you as well. So first, let's talk about theoretical underpinnings. Photovoice methodology was first introduced by Wang and Burris, and you see the date of 1994. Their groundbreaking research utilizing photography with Chinese migrant women. The aims of Photovoice projects are to put cameras in the hands of people who would otherwise not have access to participate in research, and also another aim is to allow them to be the recorders and the potential catalysts in their own communities. So I just love that, because, you know, we all say we'd like to give voice to the voiceless and we want to work towards social justice, and Photovoice methodology really allows the researcher to do this. Perhaps you've heard of Paulo Freire's work, the theory and practice of critical consciousness and empowerment education. It's really another theoretical underpinning of Photovoice. Documentary film, again, putting those cameras directly in the hands of people who otherwise wouldn't have access to basically to share to document and share the realities, their lived realities. Freire talks about critical awareness of ability to make change and the knowledge that results in the practical and that's directed toward action. And feminist theory, really the basis also for Photovoice, due to the fact that feminist theory talks about empowerment education and represents the idea of reducing hierarchical relationships and examines the power imbalances between the researcher and the participant. And in Photovoice methodology, we attempt to reduce that power imbalance, and I'll explain to you a little bit more about that further along in the presentation. So why would we want to utilize this type of methodology? again, as I shared with you, we can really get more of a sense of the lived experiences of those in vulnerable populations, who maybe we wouldn't have access to otherwise, or especially if we're just observing as an outsider. So it gives us that access as a researcher. And as I mentioned earlier, giving voice to a voiceless, vulnerable population. And I'm just get excited about the fact that our research, you know, visuals really help. You know, you hear the expression, a picture is represents 1,000 words, or whatever. I'm always getting expressions wrong, but I think I think you get the idea that with a visual representation, there's so much more that you can learn from, you know, about your research, your co-participants, and the body of research that you're engaging in, the particular communities that you're interested in. And how does this differ from traditional research? Well, in many ways, but two specific ways are that traditional photo voice methodology, the ultimate aim is that it translates results into action. So there's that component of advocacy for social justice issues. And the other is that your research participants are also, in a sense, co-researchers. And depending on your situation and exactly how you set it up, I'll explain that a little bit further, how much or how little you're able to involve your participants as actual co-researchers and making some of the decisions regarding the research process itself. You know, how does photo voice engage social justice? What I love about photo voice is that it can be a tool for advocacy and social justice. It's a collaborative work with communities. So again, you can invite as much participation from the community as is possible. It also recognizes the unique strengths of your research participants or your co-researchers, and it aims toward this action, this advocacy towards social change. So for me, very important reasons to want to engage in this type of research. And I learned so much. I feel like if I am going to research a specific community and I am not part of that community, there is a power differential. There is a component where I want to be able to share those voices, but in a very respectful way. So goals of photo voice methodology, typically we want to record and reflect community strengths. We also want to promote critical dialogue and ultimately reach policymakers so that we can affect change. So and that's in particular when we're connecting with a community, with a nonprofit organization. We want to be respectful of their wishes and needs, working from an asset-based sort of angle rather than a strengths-based model, versus, you know, just looking at what is lacking in the community. Your research questions can actually be formulated by the researchers. You can have a general question, but it may be that you also interact with your participants or your co-researchers prior to the actual data collection, and they may inform you of other questions that they have as co-researcher. They may make suggestions to you of other research questions. Your research question could also be formulated by the agency or the nonprofit organization that you're connecting with to conduct the research. And that's very important, and I'll show you an example of that as well. In general, you know, how do we recruit and what kind of technology do we use with a photo voice project? So remember, we're asking our participants to go out and take photos that are significant to them, and I'll show you specific examples. So we have a purposeful sample, right? we're looking for specific folks in the community who are willing to participate, to take photos, to come back and talk to us about the photos that they took, these visual representations. When you recruit, you have to recruit with attrition in mind. I think that happens with any research project. It's going to happen with this project also because you're working with, in many cases, connecting with community. They've got a lot of other things going on in their lives, and so are not always able to follow through on completing the project, right? So this just happens. Thinking about, are you able to offer any kind of remuneration? That's not always the case. And in the case of the 3 photo projects that I've conducted, we have simply printed photos, and we're able to give printed photos to folks that would not otherwise perhaps have a photo. So that we weren't able to offer anything more than that. But you can think about, are there ways that you can offer anything? And that's also based on, you know, the regulations of your IRB. And what about, will you set up flyers to recruit or to get the word out? Will you be recruiting via word of mouth, or will your community organization also that you're connected with, will they be helping you to recruit? Will you use cameras, and what kind of cameras? And this is interesting when you think about cultural norms. You have to think about your population. Are they, do they know how to run a basic digital camera? Or if most people have cell phones in the culture of the community that where you're conducting the research, then maybe that's an option that folks use their cell phones. So you need to really know your participants, understand the culture, get to know, so that you can be culturally sensitive as far as the background of your participants, you know, and their comfort levels with the technology. That is really important when you start to think of technology and exactly what kind of cameras and how will they upload to a site? Will you print them out? How exactly will you do that? And then Photovoice does require that you think about what kind of training will you offer to your participants or co-researchers. So during the training, you would review the project goals. You would do an overview of camera use. If you are distributing cameras, you will want to show the basics of how to use the cameras. You may also want to provide them, if your IRB approves, a release form for the photos that they take, if they take photos that have people appear in them. Or you may want to share with them that it isn't a good idea to be taking photos that show people's faces because we wouldn't be able to use them in the project, or it could be dangerous for them to do so. Depends on where they are and what part of the world and what neighborhood. Is it okay to go out on the street and take photos of people, right? And is that a culturally sensitive thing to do? You should also, in your training, talk to your co-participants about an estimated number of photos that you expect. If you don't do that, you could have fewer photos than you were really hoping for. So setting sort of a goal in mind is going to be really helpful, and having some sort of deadline, you know, by when the photos need to come back to you. Okay, so that's really, first we have the recruiting, then you have some type of training that you're going to offer to participants, and in a way that you have set up where you will ask them to discuss the photos. So in my projects, typically, you know, there are more photos than we have time to discuss. So we will ask the co-participants to choose the photos that they want to talk about. And there are a few different publications that you can access. One is Hussey, who came up with this prompt called Photo, where you have these just simple open-ended questions where you want the co-participant or your subject to talk about the photos. And this is really important, that you play the role of just the active listener, right? You don't want to really be guiding that conversation in a way that would You don't want to step in as a researcher and sort of guide that conversation in a way that is going to, you know, that is going to influence your data, right? It needs to be really open-ended. So describe this photo, what's happening, why did you take it, and what does this photo tell us about your life or about this particular situation that you're studying or context that you're studying, and how can this photo make a positive change? Those are the questions that Hussey proposes. You may want to adjust those as needed. Also, when you have a discussion about photos, your co-participants could, there are two formats really. The traditional Photovoice project, the proposal is that participants would gather as a focus group format, and you would record those sessions, and they would share their photos on the screen and talk about them, and then everyone else in the focus group could also comment on the photos. So it's a sharing, but it's also a way that you have a group together, and you would need to have some sort of community building experience so that everyone feels comfortable with one another, and you talk about the confidentiality of that focus group. And then the co-participants would also select photos for an action step. In some cases, it's a publication or an exhibit or some type of advocacy project that they would be involved in as well. My projects did not take that route exactly, so I'm going to share with you the variation that I used for Photovoice, but the traditional method is to have participants go out, take the photos, and have specific dates when they come back and they participate in these focus group sessions where they're sharing their photos they took and discussing them. And they have to choose the photos that they're going to discuss. So what are some of the challenges? Again, we talked about the fact that enough photos, you need to make that very clear so that your participants take enough photos to then have choices of what photos to talk about, and so that you have significant data later. So you don't want your participants to just be going out and taking 5 photos. You want to tell them, well, 20, 25 is good, or do you want 50? You know, what is the amount that you want? Typically, you know, this is qualitative research, so your participant pool is going to be likely somewhere between 10 and 15, unless you can recruit a few more. But, you know, that's a good size for a qualitative study. You do have to always keep in mind the power differential. You're the researcher coming from outside. You want to always try to be very inclusive and culturally aware. So all of the cultural empathy that you've practiced in the past and cultural humility, you want to definitely put into practice as a researcher conducting from the recruitment to the training to also the stage of focus groups or interviews. So with all of your interactions with community members who are also co-participants, right? There is that participant bias that Mathi and Schuler wrote about, which is really interesting, that you do want to assure your co-participants or your co-researcher, your participants, that you want their perspective on their situation. So you want to try to convince them that they don't have to take certain photos that you want them to take, a certain angle or a certain vision or perspective that you're looking for. You want to assure them that their vision, perspective, their lived reality is what you want to learn about in this project, and that it's a project that that we're all putting our heads together to understand and to advocate for, right? So you don't want someone to go out and take pictures and think like, oh, I think they want me to take pictures of, you know, street scenes or something, or my beautiful neighborhood, you know, the beauty in my neighborhood. So you want to really try hard to get that point across. And then the other challenge is if they take photos of human subjects, you know, how to protect the anonymity of those other subjects, and whether you want to get into some kind of permission form on the spot, or how you want to handle that, or will those photos be photos that they can take but they won't be shared, you know, in publications, but they could be analyzed. So there are a lot of questions about how to protect not only your co-participants as they take photos, but also the folks that maybe they're taking photos of, so other people that may appear in the photos. So that's a consideration for sure. And then adaptations. So I definitely have done some of these, actually all of these adaptations to the traditional photo voice research. One is if you are working with populations who may have disabilities or cannot take their own photos. For instance, I'm going to share in a moment a project we did with children. And so we had children from the age of preschool through middle school. And so preschoolers ages 3 and 4 had to ask mom to take photos, right? They didn't necessarily know how to use a camera, although some children now know how to operate a phone pretty well. Or if you're dealing with folks that have disabilities and aren't really able to use their hands to take a photo, they would have to ask someone else. They would, you know, identify the photo and then have someone take it. Another adaptation, as I mentioned previously, instead of focus groups, what we have done typically for our research are one-on-one interviews. Basically because the focus groups take a lot more organization. You're asking all of your co-researchers to come back on specific dates and bring photos, not only once, but twice or 3 times. And instead, what we've done, because we were conducting research internationally and we were not necessarily going to be on site for a length of time where we could hold focus groups, we set up times when our co-researchers could come back with their photos, and we did one-on-one interviews utilizing some of the suggested prompts. So we created our own for individual interviews with the co-researchers or participants. And the beauty of it is that your co-researchers are actually selecting the visuals that will be the subject of the interviews. Recruiting through a nonprofit organization is also an adaptation, so that when you go out into community and you want to learn more about a community, you may learn through Dr. Martina, or maybe that you already have connections with a nonprofit that you've worked with in the past, and that's great. And they can, you can ask them if this research would be helpful to them in their advocacy work. And would they support your research to be able to basically allow you to use their space, or even to assist you in recruiting. And in one case that happened, in another it semi-happened, so I'm going to show you 2 examples of that. But those are some adaptations. So project examples. The 2 examples I'm going to show you were both partnered with nonprofit organizations. And in both cases, we were working with vulnerable populations as well. So the first example is work that we did with Casa de Paz, which is an organization that promotes wellness for women and children, specifically Latina populations, so Spanish speaking from various countries in Latin America, who have been living in Cincinnati and who have suffered the trauma of domestic violence in the home. So Casa de Paz is a transition home for them, and the program is typically 6 months to sometimes 9 months. And it's a very new organization. So they were really interested in promoting this holistic wellness for the children and adolescents residing in the home. What happened to us for this research was the pandemic. So the house opened in January of 2020. So as you know, the pandemic, well, hit us pretty pretty clearly it was around March. So the House barely got started with receiving families before the pandemic hit. And the children were all in virtual schooling. So we had some questions about, what's the average day like for the children who live at Casa de Paz, and how do they spend their time? And what do the children like and don't like about their current daily activities? What do they think would improve their average day? And what were their different needs as far as physical, social, emotional, cognitive? Those were our research questions. We were not going to be able to find those out by doing observation in the home, because with the pandemic, the home was really not available to researchers to be in the home and do observations. The children were in virtual schooling. As you can imagine, days were probably pretty chaotic during that time. So what did we do? Well, we had to spend a bit of time working on our internal review board, institutional review board application. It did require a full board review. It didn't go through an expedited review because we were working with vulnerable population, not only children, but children who had suffered trauma of domestic violence. So we went through intense review of about 3 revisions. And when I say we, this was an interdisciplinary team, myself as a Spanish professor and education professor, as well as my colleague in occupational therapy and another colleague in child psychology. So we had consent forms that had to be translated to Spanish. We also had multiple consent forms because the Institutional Review Board wanted consent forms that were for preschoolers, so really the moms signed them, and then school-aged children had their own assent form, and moms had to sign as well. So there were a lot of forms to keep track of, and the poor moms did have to sign a lot of forms. But once we did get that all taken care of, and also we had to assure the Institutional Review Board that we were going to follow not only the protocol for COVID-19 safety within the home, but the university protocol. So all of the recruiting was done outside. So participant recruiting was done in August 2020. I went to the home, I met with mothers outside and the children, and we talked about the project and made sure that they understood, guaranteeing that it was a non-coercive context for them. Again, it did require multiple travel back and forth on my part to the home to be able to present to moms because of their work schedules. And also I had to keep in mind the literacy levels of moms, because some, had more education than others, but we have migrants that have come from Guatemala with, just like a third grade reading level. So in some cases, really considering what they could read. And as you know, the Institutional Review Board consent forms can be very lengthy. So we had to be very, very cognizant of that. And then once we got all that done, I did issue a very simple digital camera to each family. And we had to mark the cameras and kind of keep track of which photos went with which child. And it turned out to be a really fun activity for the kids during the quarantine and their virtual schooling. We got a lot of photos of, the kinds of things they were watching and doing on their computer during the day. Their favorite toys, their favorite videos, their favorite foods, and activities that they like to do together. So it did turn out to be pretty fun for them. And then our idea was we conducted interviews with the children, with their mothers present, and with my colleague in child psychology present as well. But it did require some interpreting on my part, because sometimes the children spoke more English than they did Spanish, but the moms only spoke Spanish, and my child psychologist colleague did not speak much Spanish, So I did interpreting on the spot, and we recorded those interviews. We conducted them by Zoom. The way that we were able to do it was really helpful. My colleague in child psychology, she would be able to share on the screen from a drive all of the photos that that particular child had taken. And then we let the child choose from the screen one of the photos, and then we enlarged that photo and asked the child to talk about it. And we did that for 5 photos. What happened with that? So let's see. This looks a little out of order, but it's okay. So we did use the variation of the methodology because we interviewed individual children and their mom with their moms present. Typically, our internal review board does not want the photos with people to be published, so we have to work within those parameters. But when there were photos that did not involve people, we were able to include those. So you can see here the toy room in the house. We gained an understanding of life in the transition home during the pandemic in a way that we never would have been able to otherwise. And the photos were a really great way to prompt conversation, because if we had just wanted to do a qualitative research project interviewing each of the children about their day, I don't think it would have gone as well as being able to have these photos that they took and then they could talk about. So it was a great way to prompt conversation. Okay, this is the slide I was thinking of. We actually did a modification to the IRB so that we could conduct subsequent interviews with the moms. Because one thing we found was that we needed further data from the perspective of the moms. The descriptions with some of the young children were not very, there wasn't a lot of description. So although we have information that we could share, sometimes what I think was interesting is that children don't know what possibility exists beyond their current context. So moms could think of things like, well, I'd like them to be able to go outside to swing a little bit between their classes or during their research because they're sitting inside all day on their computers. And that was just an example of a comment from a mom. So as far as the methodology and the analysis of the interviews, they were recorded. Then we had a research assistant that helped with transcriptions. It was interesting because it involved both languages, so there was a need to review them and make sure that all of the translations and everything was caught correctly. So I did that, and with the help of the student that transcribed. And then the analysis, well, we had a combination of open coding of the transcripts, and we looked at the themes. We compared themes, in this case, to research on child development. And the final product for us, which was really rewarding, was the dissemination of the results. And that was the first step of this project, was to present to the board of directors of the organization, and that was in April 2021. So it was really a project over the entire academic year. We were able to include visuals and to share those results. The results will be utilized and are being utilized by the nonprofit organization to apply for grants and also to inform them as far as summer programming. And they have renovated a 3rd floor attic space where they're now setting up a really interesting playroom and taking into account all of the research that we presented to them. And then our goal is to complete an academic manuscript based on the project. So there was an advocacy component as well as an academic manuscript that will come out of it. And the second project is an ongoing project. It was originally, it's a grant-funded project. It's an internal grant through the Women of Excellence program here at Xavier. And we titled it Family Voices from the Border. There is our university is a Jesuit university, and there's a Jesuit-sponsored nonprofit called Kino Border Initiative, which is an international organization because it is on the border literally exists in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. And we wanted to know what are the daily living experiences of women, children, and families as they wait at the Mexican border to petition the United States government for asylum. If you've heard anything at all about what's going on with at our border with Mexico, our previous government shut down the border, and typically families were able to cross the border and immediately ask for asylum, and that was cut off. So we wanted to find out what was it like for thousands of families who are now stuck in Mexico, waiting and waiting and waiting, and they have basically they're a number on a list, and some of them are waiting up to a year or more just to petition for an asylum case to be heard. So we wanted to conduct a Photovoice project. We again had to required full board review, and that was quite a lengthy process, but we were able to do it. Specific concerns were, again, vulnerable population, but the protection of identity, because identity could influence an asylum case if one reached that point. The safety of the participants, previous trauma that they may have experienced, and again, COVID protocols. So we were able to receive the approval in late May, or late June, and we traveled in July. We were present for 1 week in person. We were all masked up and we were all vaccinated, so the organization was willing to work with us, but they preferred that we independently recruit our participants. So there was no recruiting ahead of in anticipation of our arrival. We approached families who were in the soup kitchen or comedor, and also outside waiting to gain entrance. Many families had just arrived, so they were very overwhelmed by their circumstances. They were tired from their travels because they had journeyed from other points in Mexico or Central or South America to get to the border, and they were seeking basic needs at the organization: food, legal advice, clothing, showers, just a little bit of enrichment activities for their children. We were able to, during the week, we got 10 participants between the ages of 18 and 37, all women except for one, and that was the 18-year-old. The countries of origin were Mexico and Guatemala. And I would say that, again, we had 10 subjects, but we got over 150 photos. Our subjects we asked them to choose 5 photos to talk to us about. We did the interviews in Spanish, so they're being transcribed, and then they'll be translated to English. Some of the themes that came up during the interviews were their pride in their culture and their family. Also the trauma that they had experienced, and usually it was the reason for them to flee their current circumstances. And the interviews were absolutely emotional. There was a psychologist on staff and on hand waiting to talk to anyone following the interview. And then I can share with you that, as I said, the transcription's in progress. But as far as the photo analysis, we did conduct a photo analysis of all of the photos, and we've grouped them into 4 categories or themes. We have photos of people, of the environment, of various occupations or people doing things, and we have a category that's hope. I would say that of the people photos, it's interesting that many of the photos that, well, all of them were of their family members. And that was also because we cautioned folks not to take pictures of other people in the streets because it may be unsafe. Also, there were a lot of family photos taken because they knew that we were going to be printing them out. And so in some cases, it was the only photo of their family that they had because they had fled their home and they didn't have any photographs printed. So those were treasured. Few people were smiling. I think 2 out of 27 photos of people were of people smiling. The rest were very serious. So that was something that struck us. Environment, we saw conditions that were very physical conditions that were very difficult, and in some cases the narration was that they were dangerous circumstances. As far as occupations in general, I can share that people showed that they wanted to be doing something. You know, waiting and not being able to work and go to school and have really anything to do. They were looking for ways that they could sweep, clean at the nonprofit. They took photos of themselves reading or playing a traditional loteria game, building together, cooperating to do different projects. And then finally, the photos of hope were photos often of sunsets, beautiful sunsets in in the southwest part of the US and just across the Mexican border, and stories of hope. There's to share a little bit with you a preview of some of what we'll be publishing and talking about. Our next step for this project is a panel presentation on critical migration that we'll be presenting in November. And also we have a January 14th date for next step for the grant part of the project, which is an exhibit. It's an advocacy project including photos, a documentary, and then artwork that the children did while we were there with them. And finally, I think to conclude, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the advantages that I've seen of utilizing Photovoice methodology, as well as my next slide has a few recommendations for you. So advantages. This is particularly useful for application with vulnerable populations because what I love is it grants agency to your participants. They get to choose what photos they take. They also get to choose what they talk about. So your research and your data is completely informed in that way by the participants. Your participants select the photos and they elaborate on them during the interviews. The stories and perspectives are of their lives and the aspects of their lives that they find relevant and that they're comfortable sharing with researchers. And then furthermore, Photovoice methodology provides the opportunity for the application of a more culturally sensitive inquiry and cultural humility on the part of the researchers. And I think that's a really important component. It also really, in the case of the research in Nogales, it also, however, did create some vicarious trauma for those of us that heard those stories because they were very powerful. But they did, the hope that was shared and the resilience, this incredible resilience, is also something that I always must remember about the research subjects. My recommendations for you are to really educate your institutional review board on the basics of Photovoice because this methodology is not as common as the typical qualitative research design. So you want to spend a bit of time just sharing, you know, why this research is important, why the methodology is important, and a bit about, you know, the specifics and the steps and why you're doing it. Allow enough time for each phase of the research process because it does take time. Resist the urge to force recruitment. As I said, you know, people in vulnerable circumstances are not always going to be able to come back with the camera, or they may not be able to come back the day that they said they would, or, you know, their lives are, there is so much going on and so much that's not determined, that they are not able to determine, a place to sleep, a place to eat, that they may not be able to bring the camera back to you when you thought they would. Consider your prompts really carefully, and along with that, as I mentioned earlier, practicing active listening is really important because the interview is not about you or your perspective, so you do want your interviewees to be doing all of the talking and to try not to guide, you know, you want them to be that agent of change and agent of advocacy. continually check your privilege so that you are really practicing cultural sensitivity and humility, particularly if in your research design, but also as you're conducting the interviews. As I was the one in both of these projects that, with my colleagues in occupational therapy and child psychology, I was the one that was able to apply my Spanish proficiency. And plan ahead for your technology and be flexible, because as I said, you know, different circumstances will come up for your research subjects / co-participants. We had at the border, we had 2 cameras that didn't come back to us, and we really accounted for that. At Casa de Paz here in Cincinnati, of course, we were able to retrieve cameras, but there were other issues, like, you know, some photos were blurry because the children took them. So not everything is going to turn out exactly as you plan or envision. And another project I did in Guatemala with my colleague in occupational therapy, we were able to use disposable cameras because they had a facility who could then print those photos. So you have to kind of look at the circumstances, what folks are most comfortable with, and plan ahead on your technology in that case. So Dr. Martina, I wonder if we want to open it up to some question and answer.
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much, Prof. Diane. I'm very happy with this. I mean, all things come up as you're talking, and I had now a Photovoice study that I had disposable cameras, and it's really a challenge in Pretoria to get disposable cameras developed, because it's such old technology actually these days that you don't even get anybody to develop it, and it's really costly. I think lots of I see there's a number of community people and a lot of lecturers that's teaching on Mamelodi campus. And they must remember, Photovoice can also be used in the classroom. It's not necessary always to go into a community as such. There are really good studies on there. Is there anybody that has a question for Prof. Diane at this stage?
While we're waiting for the questions, Dr. Martin, I'm, you know, that's a good point you brought up, because if you look at some of the research on Photovoice, some of what's been published, there are studies that have been published, you know, with co-participants right on campus, where you and your students want to investigate a specific aspect on the campus itself. And so then you can send your students out as co-researchers to take the photos. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. It doesn't always have to be off campus. You can, and particularly if it, you know, depending on the course you're teaching, it may be that your students are learning this methodology as your co-researchers. So it's a beautiful and simple way to teach them about qualitative research.
Yes, and I think it's I did a few Photovoice studies with my community engagement students, and this time I did it now with the pre-university academy learners, and that was really interesting for me. But like I said, it's much better to ask them to use their smartphones than trying to get disposable cameras these days and have it developed. And it was really costly also to develop it. I thought it was not really worthwhile. Anybody a question that you want to raise? I think you also touched it. Oh, there is somebody, Mikidela.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jordan, and thank you so much, Danny, for the informative presentation. So I want to ask you about the theoretical foundation of the Photovoice research, because, for instance, if we say qualitative and quantitative approach, either they lay down on positivist or interpretism, or, you know, constructivism. So which theory foundation underpins the Photovoice study mostly? Because when I heard about your 2 project-based research, I see you focus on purposeful sampling and also inductive data analysis approach. So what is the theoretical foundation for the photo voice research?
It typically is constructivism. And that, you know, I'm sorry that I didn't mention that in the beginning, but that is the theoretical underpinning.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Martina mentioned participants using their cell phones, and that is exactly what we ended up moving toward with some of our subjects in Nogales. And folks, a lot of folks didn't even know how to use a simple point and shoot digital camera. They prefer to use their own cell phone. Yes. And then you have to think about how you will print those photos. In our case, we had a small digital printer that we could, using a cable, hook up the cell phone and get access to the photos that way. We also had set up a Gmail account just for the study so that the participants could send us the photos via Gmail if they had access to internet and Gmail. So we had a lot of we had to use a lot of different resources available for the international projects.
Any other questions from anybody at this stage? Okay. I think we are at least nearly done at, you've been talking more than an hour, because she and I was talking for half an hour before we started. So I think she's all exhausted. Thank you very much for the session. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. If anyone has any other questions, I'll be happy to answer, you know, via email.
I recorded the session, and I'm going